Hi everybody, my name is Lee, and with this video I'm talking about progressive strategies going forward. The fact that there are so many various progressive groups, and I think that's a good thing. Some feel that they're competition for each other, and I'm thinking not necessarily if we look at history, and I am real soon. But first, I'm going to mention that there's also issues with our voting system, that people feel like there's no need to organize a progressive group because our election system is so tragically messed up that and unreliable that it does no good to do this. And I'm thinking that both should be done at the same time, that the mechanics and infrastructure of the electoral system should be addressed. The need for paper balloting, the need for exit polling, hand counting of those paper ballots, the need for integrity in the electoral system. This is needed, as well as progressive organizing, and that doing one or the other at different times is not necessary, that it can be done at the same time. And so some are addressing one, some are addressing the other, some are doing both, covering a lot of ground. And that it does no good to organize a progressive group and then say, okay, now we're organized, now let's address the electoral, system. Or even, okay, now we've addressed the electoral system, now let's start organizing our progressive groups. That makes no sense. So people are doing it at the same time, and I think that's a smart strategy to do. And that it's very important to address what we've seen, definitely in the past years, but certainly last year in 2016, that we've had overwhelming evidence now. For those who are still in denial that there was no rigging, come on now. There's only so much cognitive dissonance that you can actually manage to cloud your mind with regarding this. That in different arenas, it has been addressed that there were irregularities in the Democratic primary, which falsely nominated Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders, and then she was not able to pull out a win against Donald Trump because of that. That is what that resulted in. And so these things must be addressed and first acknowledged by some who still are struggling with that. But, we've had independent statistical analysis that showed that. We've had WikiLeaks giving us first-hand documentation, primary documents of a discussion of vote rigging and campaign rigging. We've had a court system down in Florida that acknowledged that the fraud and the bias and the corruption occurred. So, I mean, it's up to you. I just hope you get your mind right soon. But anyway, so that it did occur, and it must be addressed, and hopefully people will take steps. Those who are running candidates within the Democratic system, the primary system, or plan to, you're going to have to take steps to guard against repeating history. And then those outside the two-party system, or at least the Democratic Party, will have to be vigilant and decide whether you will challenge the vote integrity, if you will protect the candidates' votes that you are running into these primaries or into these general elections. Are you actually going to protect your candidate and then your candidate's voters? That has to be decided. So anyway, I'm going to keep going forward. There's two upcoming progressive meetings. One is the People's Convergence Conference. It's September 8th through 9th at American University. This is Washington, D.C. This includes Draft Ready for a People's Party, Socialist Alternative, and Progressive Independent Party. They're putting on a town hall, Draft Ready Town Hall. And then there's also People's Congress of Resistance. That's September 16th through 17th. That's Blackburn Center, Howard University, Washington, D.C. And so this is grassroots resistance on an independent path. They say that change comes from the bottom up, not the top down. And so that's their philosophy. They're calling grassroots resistors from all arenas to come to Washington, D.C. So it looks like that's going to be this weekend. Yeah, not this weekend, but the next weekend, there will be the People's Convergence Conference, the Draft Bernie people. And then the weekend after that, which is the 16th and the 17th, there will be the People's Congress of Resistance. And that's a grassroots progressive meeting. So, two opportunities to converge and confer and to meet and greet and share strategies, do some networking, get some ideas, and make plans and organize. Very important to do. And so there are different strategies going forward, and most of them agree. I would say I'm going to name off some groups, and I would say most of these groups that I'm going to name off agree on about probably 80 to 85% on their progressive platform. They are in agreement with each other. There are some sources of discrepancy between these groups. There's a question of foreign policy, which some groups seem to want to address fully: the militarism, imperialism, apartheid, and racism that's perpetrated abroad outside our borders, and how that is harming us here at home. That there's no shying away or glossing over. They do want to address this. And then there are some who prefer not to. There's also the question of domestic issues. There's apparently some groups feel a little bit of flexibility on that. The issues of misogyny, discrimination, racism, bigotry. How much flexibility is there going to be on that within a progressive movement or a progressive group or a progressive party, for fear of alienating those outside that you're trying to draw in? That question must be settled too. So actually similar questions of violence, militarism, imperialism, apartheid, racism in foreign policy, and then also the same when it comes to domestic policy, how much flexibility each group is willing to allow. Some have zero tolerance, and then some are saying, well, we can't really focus on that. We need to focus on economic things. And so that has to be settled. Anyway, let's see. Green Party is one of the long-standing progressive political parties. They're currently on either 22 or 23 ballot lines. They're completing ballot petitions right now. I mean, I think they've got one in Utah. I'm not sure if it's been approved or not. So 22 or 23 ballots. There's Working Families Party, Peace and Freedom Party, Socialist Alternative Party, with maybe one or two ballot lines for those groups. Progressive Independent Party, Draft Bernie People's Party. That I don't believe that these two parties have any ballot lines. They're organizing and building strength, and they're going to have a meeting this coming weekend to build numbers. Democratic Socialist is a faction of the Democratic Party. They are not independent, so they are using the Democratic Party's ballot lines, although some of them have actually stepped outside to use the Green Party's ballot lines to run candidates, run as Democratic Socialists on other party ballot lines. So they're not, the Democratic Socialists don't have their own ballots, but they use other people's ballots to run their ideas. Justice Democrats and Brand New Congress, both these groups have 50 state ballot access. That they plan on running Democrats, so those ballots, and then the Brand New Congress plans to run Republicans, so that ballot line, which means that they have access to all 50 ballots. even though they're running progressives against the corporate candidates within those parties. We will replace you, the Incorruptibles, local Bernie-crats, similar strategies. I think we will replace you is also targeting the Congress, and I feel that they need to work with the Justice Democrats who have already organized. Incorruptibles, local Bernie-crats, they are specifically targeting, local, municipal, county level, boards, commissions, mayoralships, legislatures, things like this, assemblies. And so they're nonpartisan. So they'll be using maybe independents, write-ins, Greens, Democrats, what have you, might be running within these groups. You've also got other groups who are not necessarily single issue, but they focus primarily on one issue, Black Alliance for Peace. Very much a peace-oriented group. Black Lives Matter. You've got Women's March. There's other groups who are running specifically or organizing around women's issues. 3-point strategies, Emily's List, Emerge America, She Should Run. And I think with some of these groups, like Emily's List, it's kind of weird that sometimes they'll choose men over women when it comes to endorsing candidates. So I don't know what that's about. But anyway, and then there's other groups like Fight for 15. So many various groups running on their official ballot line, some of them, and then some are running their issues on other parties' ballot lines, if that makes sense. So there's lots of people. There's lots of action on the left side of the dial. Lots of overlap, lots of convergence, and then some amount of divergence, maybe 80% agreement, and then maybe some discrepancies. That's happening down ballot in time for 2017, the rest of the elections for this year down ballot, and then 2018. And there's so many seats open that I think it's fine that there's this many groups who are challenging the establishment candidates for or incumbents for access to the voting power at the federal, state, and local level. I think it's necessary that that happens. And I mean, no one group, as far as I know, maybe targeting the U.S. Congress. I don't know if any one group actually has 435 candidates that they've recruited for November 2018. And so it might be that all of these groups are necessary to challenge each and every seat if necessary. If there's someone who's holding that seat that's not an incumbent that is not progressive. I mean, if they are progressive and they've shown through their voting record that they are, then maybe it's not necessary to challenge those seats. But anyway, I mean, that's just in the House. You go up, to the Senate. I think there's about maybe 36. There's governorships coming available, mayoralships, there's state legislatures, and so all across the board there are seats opening up. So I think all of these groups are necessary and needed. And it is possible, I think, for them to cooperate as long as they don't target each other for contest. Kind of fan out and spread out, kind of shift those resources around so there's full court coverage. Not everyone over here trying to do this one thing. And there's precedent. There's historical precedent, and I'm going to get into that. We can go all the way back to the effort to end a very much entrenched, perverse, immoral economic system that nearly coincided with the founding of this nation. Deeply entrenched, 200 years maybe in the making, and inconceivable that there could be life without it, at least in the South. And it was uprooted for the most part. Some remnants still remain under the 13th Amendment. So very deeply rooted and still to be addressed. But for the most part, it was officially outlawed, the economic system of slavery, and that any act against the concept of slavery or this economic system is a form of economic justice. And so that even goes as far as criminal justice reform, things like this, abolishment of private prison slavery. This is a form of economic justice. And that the people are coming about this in different ways. That back then, in the good old days, that not everyone had high-minded goals, even though they did want to end slavery. There were the Quakers. There were the free men, of color, as they called them back then. They were abolitionists on moral reasons because of the human rights abuses, the civil rights abuses, and that for some it was an abuse of their religious outlook, that it was unacceptable. The Quakers. So they're, abolitionists. There were also free soilers who didn't necessarily see it as a moral issue. They saw it as economic. That slave labor meant that they couldn't get a job or actually be paid a living wage. That the planters had too much power, and economic and political and social power, and that free men, even free white men, could not compete socially, economically with these planters. And so they were outnumbered politically. There was outsized power. And also that they couldn't get a living wage while there were slaves available to be forced to work for free. So not really high-minded. It was actually more practical, more economic, that they wanted a living wage, and the slavery was interfering with that. So they wanted to abolish slavery, one, and then prevent it from expanding into the new territories at the time. And so there were other groups who had objections to how things were going economically. And so these groups kind of formed a coalition on that cause. And it was not a perfect marriage, but it did what it needed to do. And so it's possible. There was the Whigs. They were left in disarray by a previous election. And so they were looking for a new direction and purpose. They were in play. They were available. And then there are also anti-Nebraska people who objected to the possibility of slavery extending into Nebraska territory or any of the other new territories. They didn't want slavery to expand. There was also, the Know-Nothings. They were a secretive group, and they pretended that they weren't a secretive group, but they were a secretive group. And then there were the Free Soilers. There were disaffected Whigs, disaffected Democrats, and then here and there were some Republicans. And so in 1854, this very diverse group who had some things in common, and then a lot of things that they weren't in common. The Know-Nothings in 1854 and 1855, they won 2 governorships, and they sent maybe about a certain number of candidates into the United States House. They managed to have success. And so little by little, they, little factions were sending people into office and key positions. And then there were anti-Nebraskans, the Free Soilers, some disaffected Democrats, Whigs. They also had candidates in the U.S. House by 1855. And by 1856, these diverse groups coalesced to form a united front underneath the Republican Party. And so we had people, various factions, who were organizing, making strides, placing candidates here and there, and then slowly building their numbers. And then in about 4 years, they coalesced into one group. And so they kept organizing, that kept strengthening. They didn't have enough organizational strength to win the presidency in 1856. Although, this is the Republican Party now. All these groups had coalesced. And so by 1856, John Fremont, he was their candidate for president for high office. They didn't have enough strength for him to win, but they had an indication that a win was going to come, maybe in the next go around. But he was the first Republican candidate for president. But they did have enough organization and strength to carry a large number of northern states, and then place even more candidates into the Congress. Then you had events like the Bleeding Kansas, where there's a lot of fighting over slavery in Kansas. And then by 1858, the pro-slavery Democrats began to lose political and moral ground. The anti-slavery Republicans gained about 5 additional senators in 1858 to the 20 that they already had in Congress. So they were building their numbers. Then in 1859, you had the John Brown Harper's Ferry episode, and then increased opposition to the fugitive slave law. That the country was just in an uproar over slavery. And then by then, there was enough strength. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president of the United States. And then we know what happened after that. And so, but that was the buildup, that there was definitely grassroots organizing. There were very factions, different groups. Not all of them had things in common. Not all of them had similar purpose or motivations, but they had enough in common to where they were able to coalesce behind a united front, slowly sending candidates into office at all levels. The Congress, of course, but also governorships and down ballot positions. And they built and built and built until they were able to be strong enough to have senators and then a president. And then that entire movement was able to crush the official legacy of slavery and change a deeply entrenched economic system that no one thought could be possibly changed. And so I look at all these groups that are running, and I do feel that the inside-outside strategy can be effective. There's different motivations for running inside one of the major parties, and then of course running outside. And then there's many independent groups and third-party groups that some people might decide that they want to run as write-ins, a write-in progressive, or independent progressive, or green, working families, peace and freedom, socialist alternative on those ballot lines. Whether Progressive Independent Party or the Draft Burning People's Party get ballot lines, we don't know. We'll see. And there might be people running on their ballot lines as well. And so I think the important thing is to build strength, organizing strength, of course, on the ground, grassroots level, a mass movement. And then also to send numbers into elective office to be able to affect change. And that it has been done. And so we know that it can be done because it was done. And that it is possible. And then, of course, working to fix the voting system and having the integrity to stand up for voters, not allowing voters to be assaulted by the corporatocracy trying to protect itself, that it is necessary to stand up and challenge the voting system prior to the election, during the election, and of course after the election. And so that's a lot of information. I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to say good luck.